Welcome to Occult Archives, where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books.
From mystical grimoires
To ancient religious texts, these books carry secrets too dangerous to be read.
Are you ready to turn the pages of the unknown?
This is Season 1, Episode 15,
The Voynich Manuscript.
the book no one can read.
Let's dive in.
Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a truly unique enigma.
The Voynich Manuscript.
Yeah, it's a book unlike any other, filled with an unknown script and bizarre illustrations. You sent us your curiosity and some fascinating material about it. And our mission today is to unpack what makes this manuscript the most mysterious in the world, as some have called it.
What's fascinating here is a document that has resisted all attempts at understanding for over a century.
Yeah, over a century.
We have your sources, including Brigadier John H. Tiltman's insightful paper, and together we'll explore its history, its perplexing contents, and the various attempts to unlock its secrets. This raises an important question right from the start. Why has this particular manuscript proven so stubbornly unreadable?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we're going in completely blind here, but let's start with just describing the manuscript itself. What are we dealing with physically when we talk about the Voynich manuscript?
Well, at its heart, it's a book made of vellum,
Okay.
a type of parchment made from animal skin, a common writing material in the medieval period, and it's quite substantial,
Oh, wow.
over 200 pages thick.
That's a lot of pages.
What's striking is that almost every single one of those pages is covered in text. But this isn't just any text. It's written in a script that defies all attempts at identification.
So an unknown script on nearly every page of a pretty hefty book.
Uh-huh.
That sounds like a serious commitment from whoever created it.
Yeah.
And it's not just text, is it? You mentioned illustrations as well. What can you tell us about those?
Almost all the pages, except for about 20, also feature colored drawings, and we'll get into the specifics of what these illustrations depict a little bit later. But just to really emphasize the challenge here, Tiltman points out that this mysterious script appears remarkably consistent throughout the entire book. There are only some minor additions in the margins that are in a readable script, but the main text remains a complete enigma. And despite the tireless work of countless linguists and cryptographers, we still don't have a confirmed solution for even a single word of it.
That is mind-boggling. So we have this ancient book filled with what looks like an alien language and these bizarre pictures.
Yeah.
It begs the question, who on earth wrote this thing and when?
Yeah, those are two of the biggest mysteries surrounding the manuscript. Both the authorship and the general period when it was created are completely unknown.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, as Tiltman highlights, is the apparent lack of erasures or corrections in the main body of the text. This suggests that what we have in our hands might actually be a carefully produced copy of an even earlier original.
A copy of something even older. That just adds another layer to this whole thing. And you mentioned just creating this book as it is must have been a monumental task.
It must have been. To give you a sense of the sheer scale of effort involved, Father Peterson reportedly spent 3 to 4 years just transcribing the unknown script.
Wow.
And that was without even attempting to reproduce the intricate illustrations.
So 3 to 4 years just for the text.
Yes, it really gives you an idea of the dedication it must have taken to produce this entire manuscript.
I can't even imagine. And if listeners want to get a visual idea of what we're talking about here, they can take a look at plates 1 and 2 in Tiltman's paper. Even in reproduction, you can get a sense of this incredibly dense, flowing script and how it's interwoven with these detailed illustrations.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a profoundly mysterious book with an indecipherable language, strange illustrations, potentially a copy of an even older work, and a creation that demanded immense effort. How did this object even enter the historical record? What's the known history of the Voynich manuscript?
Well, the manuscript's documented history begins in 1666 when a man named Joannes Marcus Marci of Kronland sends it from Prague to Athanasius Kircher in Rome, along with a signed letter. Before that, its history is pieced together from this letter and later discoveries. The manuscript was famously purchased by Wilfrid M. Voynich, an antiquarian bookseller, in 1912, from a chest found in an ancient castle in southern Europe. Later on, the current owner, H.P. Krauss, revealed that this castle was actually the Villa Mondragone near Rome, which was built around 1570. This villa has some interesting connections to history. It was where Pope Gregory III issued the papal bull in 1582 that reformed the calendar.
Wow.
And later it became a Jesuit college until 1953.
From a mysterious castle to a bookseller in 1912. That's quite a journey.
Yeah.
What did this letter reveal about the manuscript's past?
Well, this letter from Marcy to Kircher, dated August 19, 1666, provides some crucial, though still debated, clues.
Okay.
Marcy writes about how the book was bequeathed to him by a very close friend, and that he's sending it to Kircher specifically because he believes Kircher is the only one capable of reading it.
Oh, wow.
The letter also mentions that the previous owner had already sent Kircher a sample of the book sometime earlier, but hadn't sent the complete manuscript despite having dedicated enormous effort to trying to decipher it himself.
So even in the 17th century, this book was recognized as a significant puzzle. What else did Marcy tell us?
Perhaps most interestingly, Dr. Raphael, who served as a tutor in the Bohemian language to Ferdinand III, informed Marcy that the book had once belonged to Emperor Rudolf II.
Emperor Rudolf II. That's a name that carries some weight.
Indeed.
Wasn't he known for his rather unconventional interests?
Exactly. Rudolf II, who reigned from 1576 to 1611, was far more captivated by subjects like alchemy, astrology, and astronomy than he was by the everyday affairs of his empire.
Right.
He was a major patron of various scientists and those dabbling in the occult, including well-known figures like Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, and John Dee.
Wow, that's quite the collection of names.
And he also amassed a truly vast and eclectic collection of art and books in his court in Prague.
So the idea that Rudolf owned this mysterious book, and maybe even thought it was by Roger Bacon, as we'll talk about later, suddenly feels a bit more plausible given his interests.
It does.
What happened to the manuscript after it was in his possession?
It appears that Rudolf either loaned or perhaps even gifted the manuscript to Jacobus Horsicki de Tepinus, who died in 1622.
Okay.
Intriguingly, his name Jacobia Tepinus was discovered on the first page of the manuscript when examined under ultraviolet light.
Oh, wow.
The specific form of his name suggests he acquired the book after 1608, which is when he received his patent of nobility. Tepinus held the position of director of Rudolf's alchemical laboratory and his botanical gardens.
An alchemist and botanist connected to a book filled with strange plants and potentially cryptic knowledge. It all seems to fit.
It does, doesn't it?
What about Dr. Raphael, the one who told Marcy about Rudolph's ownership? Who was he?
Dr. Raphael, who lived from 1580 to 1644, was a lawyer and also a minor poet with connections to the imperial court, not only under Rudolf II, but also under his successors, Ferdinand II and Ferdinand III.
Okay.
So he would have been in a position to potentially have knowledge of the imperial collections and their history.
Right, and let's not forget Marcy, the individual who sent the letter to Kircher.
Right.
He was a highly respected figure, the rector of the University of Prague, a well-regarded physician-mathematician, and even an expert in Oriental languages. He was also a corresponding member of the British Royal Society and had even studied under Kircher.
Creating another layer of connection in this historical web.
Right, and then the intended recipient of the manuscript, Athanasius Kircher, was himself a major figure in the world of decipherment, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Athanasius Kircher, 1601 to 1680, was a leading Jesuit scholar of his time with a profound interest in understanding ancient and obscure scripts. He even wrote extensively on Egyptian hieroglyphics, famously, though often incorrectly attempting their decipherment. And he also authored significant works on codes and ciphers in general, including his book Polygraphia, published in 1663.
Oh, wow.
The fact that this perplexing manuscript was specifically sent to him for his expert opinion speaks volumes about the level of its perceived complexity and the hope that he might be the one to finally unlock its secrets.
So we've traced this potential historical path, maybe from Roger Bacon to Emperor Rudolf II, and to an alchemist and botanist. Then it surfaces with Marcy, who sends it to arguably the top expert in decipherment of the era, Kircher, before it then disappears again until Voynich rediscovers it centuries later. That's a pretty remarkable journey, even if some parts are still speculative.
It is.
And then let's really delve into these conjectures about its early history, particularly that intriguing link to Roger Bacon. What's the story there?
As you mentioned, Marcus's letter explicitly states that Emperor Rudolf believed Roger Bacon, who lived in the 13th century around 1214 to 1294, was the original author.
Right.
Bacon was, of course, a highly influential and somewhat enigmatic medieval scientist and philosopher who explored a wide range of subjects. And in the early 20th century, Professor Newbold even put forward the now largely discredited theory that the Voynich manuscript was actually in Bacon's own handwriting.
Newbold even had a theory about how the manuscript might have traveled from Bacon's hands all the way to Rudolf II.
He did. Newbold's conjecture involved a chain of possession that started after Bacon's death, suggesting his papers ended up in an English monastery.
Okay.
Then, with the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-16th century under Henry VIII, He proposed it was acquired by John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, a prominent figure in English politics for a time.
Okay.
From Dudley, Newbold theorized that the manuscript then passed to John Dee, a renowned scholar, mathematician, and occultist who lived in Prague for several years and was personally acquainted with Emperor Rudolf II. Finally, Newbold suggested that Dee, perhaps needing funds or seeking the emperor's favor, sold the mysterious manuscript to Rudolf.
That's a truly fascinating, albeit speculative chain of ownership connecting a 13th century scholar to a 17th century emperor.
Yeah.
And there's that really interesting, almost anecdotal tidbit about John Dee's son mentioning a mysterious book his father spent a great deal of time on, but was never able to decipher.
Exactly. Sir Thomas Browne, a noted 17th century physician and writer, quoted Arthur Dee, John Dee's son, as saying that his father possessed a book containing nothing but hieroglyphics, which book his father bestowed much time upon, but I could not hear that he could make it out. It's certainly plausible that this book of hieroglyphics was indeed the Voynich Manuscript, given John Dee's known intellectual pursuits and his direct connection to Rudolf II during his time in Prague. It's quite conceivable that the emperor might have entrusted such a perplexing object to him for his scholarly own engine and potential decipherment. Of course, we need to remember that the term hieroglyphics in that era wouldn't necessarily refer specifically to Egyptian writing as we understand it today, but was often used more broadly to describe any unknown or symbolically dense script.
So while Newbold's specific claim about Bacon's handwriting hasn't stood the test of time, the connection to Dee and Rudolph still feels like a potentially significant thread in the manuscript's early history. Now let's shift our focus to what makes the Voynich manuscript so visually arresting and just plain weird.
Yeah.
The illustrations. What can you tell us about the different categories of drawings found within its pages?
Based on the Krauss catalog, the manuscript originally consisted of 116 leaves, though only 102 remain today, including several that are folded, creating larger pages when opened. Within these pages, there are an estimated 400 botanical drawings, 33 that appear to be astrological or astronomical in nature, along with approximately 350 individual star figures scattered throughout, and 42 drawings classified as biological, the majority of which include human figures, often in rather peculiar situations. Additionally, there are 34 pages dedicated to what are described as pharmaceutical drawings depicting various vessels and plant-like forms. All of these illustrations are rendered in a consistent palette of colors, including shades of green, brown light, yellow, blue, and dark red.
That's a truly diverse range of illustrations covering everything from plants and stars to human figures and what look like medicinal preparations. Let's start with the botanical drawings, given they make up the largest portion. Are these depictions of plants that we can readily identify?
That's a great question, and the answer is surprisingly complex.
Mm-hmm.
On the 125 pages featuring botanical drawings, the situation is quite perplexing. While some have been speculatively identified as resembling known plant species,
Okay.
for instance, Plate 5 bears a resemblance to some form of bindweed,
Okay.
and Plate 6 appears to be a fairly recognizable depiction of cross-leaved heath.
Okay.
The identification of Plate 7 as a sunflower has sparked considerable debate.
Oh.
This is because sunflowers are generally believed to have been introduced to Europe only after Columbus's voyages to the Americas, suggesting a possible post-1493 date for at least that particular illustration.
I see the problem.
However, this identification is not universally accepted, and some argue it could be another similar-looking plant.
So even a seemingly recognizable plant like a sunflower raises questions about the manuscript's dating. But you also mentioned that many of these botanical illustrations appear to be composite.
Yes, indeed. Many of the botanical drawings, like the example shown in Plate 8, seem to depict plants that are a bizarre combination of different species. They have the roots of one type of plant, the leaves of another, and the flowers of yet a third.
Frankenstein plants.
Exactly, making them impossible to definitively link to any known botanical classification. Tiltman even mentions the challenges he faced in reproducing some of these illustrations in his paper as he was working from copies of copies, underscoring how long and how intensely this manuscript has been studied.
Hybrid plants in a book filled with an unknown language, it just adds another layer of strangeness to the whole enigma.
It does.
What about the astronomical and astrological drawings? What can you tell us about those?
These illustrations occupy 26 pages and predominantly feature circular diagrams, including what appear to be zodiacal representations. It's believed there was likely one or perhaps two pages dedicated to each month of the zodiac, although some seem to be missing from the current manuscript. What's particularly intriguing is that around the periphery of each of these circular diagrams, there are depictions of approximately 30 small human figures,
Okay.
often arranged in seemingly symbolic ways. Plate 11 shows two facing pages that seem to represent April. One page features a black bowl surrounded by 15 unclothed female figures, while the facing page shows a white bowl with 15 clothed female figures. At some later point, someone added the names of the months in the center of these diagrams using a readable script, although the language of these additions is itself a subject of debate among scholars.
Human figures intimately connected with zodiacal signs. That certainly aligns with typical astrological imagery of the period. But the specific details, like the differing colors of the bowls and the unclothed figures, are certainly open to interpretation.
Definitely.
What about these biological drawings that include human figures? You mentioned they were often in unusual contexts.
These drawings are found on 28 pages, and as the description suggests, primarily feature human figures, often both male and female, in what can only be described as rather bizarre or surreal scenarios. They're frequently depicted interacting with strange interconnected networks of tubes or vessels, and sometimes they appear to be immersed in fluid-filled containers. Tiltman himself readily admits that the meaning and interpretation of these particular drawings fall outside his area expertise, and scholarly interpretations by historians of medicine and the body in the medieval and early Renaissance periods vary quite widely. You can see a particularly odd example of this type of drawing in Plate 12.
Bizarre human figures in what sound like biological or perhaps even alchemical settings. It definitely fuels the more out-there theories surrounding the manuscript. And then we have the pharmaceutical drawings. What do those depict?
There are 34 pages that seem to be devoted to what might be elements of a pharmacopoeia,
Okay.
a collection of medicinal preparations.
Right.
These pages feature drawings of various types of vessels like jars and retorts, along with depictions of plant-like forms and what could be interpreted as ingredients or processed substances. Plate 13 provides a representative example of this section of the manuscript.
So really eclectic mix of botanical, astronomical, astrological, biological, and pharmaceutical themes, all interwoven with this text that refuses to yield its meaning. What about the sections of the manuscript that contain only text without any accompanying illustrations?
There are approximately 20 pages at the very end of the manuscript that consist solely of the unknown script without any illustrations whatsoever. Interestingly, the very first page of the entire manuscript, which is shown in Plate 14, strongly appears to be a table of contents.
Okay.
It's divided into 4 distinct paragraphs, and these paragraphs seem to correspond in their ordering and perhaps their content to the 4 main illustrated sections we've just discussed: the botanical, the astronomical, astrological, the biological, and the pharmaceutical sections.
A table of contents for a book that no one has been able to read for centuries.
Yeah.
There's almost a darkly humorous irony to that, isn't there? And you mentioned that the very last page, Plate 15, have some hints of readable script on it, according to your notes.
Yes, the final page of the manuscript is quite peculiar and has drawn a lot of attention. Only a relatively short passage is written in the characteristic unknown script. However, there seems to be some evidence of what might be incomplete or abbreviated Latin words interspersed within it. And then at the very end of the page, there's an unfinished sentence that looks as though it might have been started in either Old English or Old German using recognizable letter forms. It's as if the author, or perhaps a later reader attempting to understand the text, began to write something in a familiar language and then abruptly stopped mid-sentence.
Wow, a tantalizing glimpse of something potentially understandable right at the beginning with the table of contents, and then again at the very end with that unfinished sentence. It's almost as if the manuscript is deliberately teasing us with the possibility of comprehension.
It really is quite strange.
Now let's delve into the numerous proposed solutions to this enduring enigma. You've already mentioned that Professor Newbold's theory has been largely discredited, but perhaps we should start there, as it was one of the earliest and most dramatic attempts to crack the code.
Professor William Romaine Newbold announced in the early 1920s, specifically around 1921, that he had successfully deciphered the Voynich Manuscript and that its author was none other than Roger Bacon.
Wow, okay.
His interpretation claimed that the manuscript revealed Bacon possessed advanced scientific knowledge centuries ahead of his time, including detailed descriptions of telescopes and microscopes long before their accepted invention, and even depictions of the Andromeda Galaxy, something that Newbold himself was reportedly unaware of at the time.
That would have been an absolutely revolutionary discovery if it had been proven true. What was the methodology he used to arrive at these incredible conclusions?
Well, Newbold's method was extraordinarily complex, involving a multi-step process of interpretation. The initial key, as later described by Elizabeth Friedman, involved meticulously examining each individual stroke that made up the characters of the unknown script.
Okay.
And then converting these seemingly insignificant pen strokes into a form of Greek shorthand.
Okay.
However, This is where the theory began to unravel. Subsequent analysis by experts in paleography, that is, the study of ancient handwriting, pointed out that what Newbold perceived as deliberate coded strokes were far more likely to be simply cracks in the ink, uneven spreading of the ink on the vellum, or just natural imperfections and degradation of the writing surface over centuries.
Yeah.
Even Newbold himself reportedly admitted that he often couldn't consistently interpret the same text in exactly the same way using his own system, which fundamentally undermined the reliability and reproducibility that are essential for any valid decipherment method.
So his initial pronouncements caused quite a stir, but ultimately the foundation of his decipherment was deemed flawed.
Precisely. Professor John M. Manley delivered a decisive critique of Newbold's theory in a 1931 publication, meticulously demonstrating that his method lacked the necessary precision and that it couldn't consistently produce a single coherent plain text from the cipher, a fundamental requirement for any legitimate decipherment. Ultimately, Newbold's interpretation failed to gain any lasting support within the scholarly community.
Right.
Newbold himself passed away in 1926, and his book, The Cipher of Roger Bacon, was published posthumously, leaving behind what Tiltman rather diplomatically describes as a legacy of ill feeling among those who had engaged with his ideas.
Wow.
Plate 16 in Tiltman's paper shows an example of Newbold's attempted interpretation, and even to the untrained eye, you can see how subjective the process seems to be.
Right.
So a major takeaway here is how easily misinterpretations can arise when dealing with such an enigmatic text, even for brilliant minds. It highlights the need for rigorous and reproducible methods, which Newbold's ultimately lacked.
A scientific breakthrough that turned out to be based on subjective readings of ink marks. It serves as a potent reminder of the challenges inherent in trying to unlock the secrets of the past. What about the other proposed solutions that you mentioned earlier? Were any of those met with more acceptance?
Unfortunately, no.
Oh.
In 1943, a lawyer named Feely published a book confidently titled Roger Bacon's Cipher, the Right Key Found.
Okay.
However, his approach was widely criticized as being unmethodical and ultimately produced a medieval Latin text filled with highly questionable and inauthentic abbreviations, which failed to convince scholars. Then, in 1946, a Dr. Lionel C. Strong offered yet another interpretation, claiming to have deciphered portions of the manuscript and identifying a certain Anthony Ascom as the author, with the underlying language being medieval English.
Okay.
Again, his resulting medieval English was deemed unacceptable by experts in the field. He also notably failed to reveal the specifics of his decipherment key, and his description of the cipher method was considered nonsensical by experienced cryptologists.
So 2 more attempts that ultimately didn't withstand scholarly scrutiny. You also mentioned a curious, almost coincidental connection you stumbled upon regarding this Anthony Ascom. What was that about?
Yes, while looking into Dr. Strong's claims, I came across the information that Anthony Ascom, who was a physician and also a clergyman in the mid-16th century, was credited with some later editions of the popular Banque's Herbal.
Okay.
Interestingly, the title pages of these editions made promises of including astrological additions to the botanical information,
Okay.
but these promise sections never actually appeared in the published books. Ascom also published various almanacs during his career, one of which Tiltman had the opportunity to examine and described as being a rather simple Christian calendar with standard astronomical information for the year.
Wow.
It's a peculiar little detail, this unfulfilled promise of astrological content in a herbal associated with Ascom, given the astrological-looking diagrams in the Voynich Manuscript. But it doesn't really lend any weight to Strong's debunked decipherment. It's more of a strange historical footnote.
Interesting, but ultimately another path that leads to a dead end in solving the core mystery of the manuscript. Now let's turn our attention to Brigadier Tiltman's own preliminary analysis from the 1950s. He actually focused his efforts on the unillustrated pages of the manuscript, right?
Yes, that's correct. Brigadier Tiltman, a highly respected cryptographer who had played a significant role in Allied code-breaking efforts during World War II, worked on photostatic copies of the approximately 20 unillustrated pages found at the end of the Voynich Manuscript.
Okay.
He adopted a more systematic linguistic approach, substituting arbitrary letters and figures for the unknown symbols, using a system somewhat similar to methods employed by William F. Friedman's wartime study group. Tiltman limited his initial analysis to a set of 17 primary symbols, treating certain visually similar glyphs as variations of these core symbols. Plate 17 in his paper illustrates his substitution system.
And what were the key observations that Tiltman was able to make based on this methodical analysis of the script itself?
He noted several recurring features. Firstly, despite his careful substitutions and analysis of frequency, he was unable to definitively identify any single symbol with a specific letter or sound from any known language.
Hmm.
He also observed a complete absence of any form of punctuation throughout the text. He identified certain recurring combinations of his substituted letters, such as DZ and HZ, which appeared to function as infixes within what seemed to be words. He also noted that the symbol he represented as E occurred with a notably high frequency at the end of lines.
Okay.
Furthermore, he observed that paragraphs frequently began with what appeared to be variant forms of the symbols he represented as D or H.
Okay.
He also paid particular attention to the behavior of the symbol he substituted with G, noting that it often appeared at the beginning of lines or was preceded by the symbol he transcribed as 8,
Right.
suggesting a possible function as a separator or connector between elements. Interestingly, he also observed instances where this G symbol seemed to appear in place of his O symbol in astronomical captions.
So even without cracking the code, Tiltman was able to identify some interesting structural patterns within the unknown script. What about the potential word structure? Did he uncover any clues regarding how words might be formed or what kinds of suffixes or prefixes might exist?
Yes, he made some intriguing observations in that area. He attempted to break down what appeared to be words into potential roots and suffixes.
Okay.
He noticed that certain combinations of his substituted letters, particularly those beginning with his A symbol,
Okay.
such as AR or AIAL, appeared with characteristic frequencies throughout the manuscript, even appearing strung together in sequences. For example, he noted that the combination AR was frequently doubled AR, whereas another common combination AUL was rarely, if ever, doubled.
Huh.
He observed similar patterns with combinations, starting with his O symbol, primarily OR and OE.
Interesting. And his interpretation of these recurring A and O groups led him to some interesting, though ultimately unproven speculations about the nature of the underlying language, didn't it? Something about a very early form of universal language.
That's right. The recurring behavior of these A and O groups led him to speculate that they might represent some kind of systematic spelling, perhaps within a very primitive form of synthetic universal language that was attempting to express grammatical inflections through these combinations. He calculated that there were approximately 24 possible two-letter combinations of his A and O symbols, which could potentially be further modified by prefixes. However, without any knowledge of the base language, if one even existed in a conventional sense, it was incredibly difficult to make any definitive progress.
Right.
He also made the crucial observation that the spaces between the letter groups in the manuscript might not necessarily represent the divisions between individual words or distinct concepts, further complicating the analysis.
Yeah, that throws a wrench in the works.
Yeah.
He also noted some potential rules or patterns regarding the order of precedence of symbols within these apparent words and the repetition of certain words, right?
Exactly. Tiltman formed the impression that each symbol within the unknown script seemed to have a specific and perhaps predictable place within the structure of these word-like units,
Okay.
suggesting a level of internal grammatical consistency.
Right.
He also noted that some of the more frequently occurring words would occasionally repeat, sometimes even appearing 2 or 3 times in succession. Furthermore, he highlighted the frequent repetition of his substituted letters C and I within certain suffix-like forms, suggesting that this repetition likely held some systematic significance within the grammar of the unknown language.
And what about Peter Long's suggestion that some of these recurring letter groups, particularly the A groups, might actually represent Roman numerals?
Peter Long did propose the interesting idea that certain A-based letter groups might be a disguised form of Roman numerals. For instance, he suggested that AHL could represent IIJ or the third,
Okay.
and ARAE could be XXV. While this could potentially account for the high frequency of some of these combinations, it also created numerous inconsistencies and led to many impossible numerical combinations when applied more broadly across the text.
Right.
Ultimately, while it was an intriguing thought, it didn't provide a viable key to unlocking the fundamental language of the manuscript.
So close, but no cigar. Tutman also made note of some unusual pages where the symbols appeared in isolation or in very short repeating series, which seemed quite different from their typical usage within the longer blocks of text.
Yes. Plates 18, 19, and 20 in his paper depict sections of the manuscript where the symbols behave quite differently. Plate 18 shows a sequence where a cycle of just 6 or 7 symbols, including his representations of DH02GC and another unidentified symbol, repeats multiple times.
Right.
Plate 19 features a circular diagram where the same series of 17 symbols is repeated 4 times in a room. And Plate 20 displays a rather peculiar vertical column composed of a seemingly arbitrary sequence of symbols. What's particularly noteworthy is that these isolated sections contain some symbols that are rarely, if ever, encountered in the main body of the text, suggesting they might have a specialized function or belong to a different layer of information within the manuscript.
And Tiltman's overarching conclusion from his initial analysis was that the underlying text was likely not a simple substitution cipher, where each symbol directly corresponds to a letter or sound in a known language.
That's precisely what he concluded. Based on the statistical behavior of the symbols, their frequencies, their patterns of combination, and their distribution throughout the manuscript, he argued that the text exhibited characteristics that were inconsistent with a straightforward substitution cipher. He further pointed out the intriguing observation that the lack of long repeating word sequences beneath the botanical drawings stood in contrast to what appeared to be more formulaic captions accompanying the star charts in the astronomical section, suggesting that different parts of the manuscript might even operate under different linguistic principles.
This brings us to the theories surrounding the possibility of the Voynich manuscript being written in some form of universal language.
Yeah.
You mentioned that William Friedman, after reviewing Tiltman's work, leaned towards the idea of a very early synthetic universal language.
Yes. After reading Tiltman's detailed report, Friedman, who was himself a brilliant cryptographer, revealed his long-held suspicion that the underlying script might be based on a very early and perhaps quite primitive form of a synthetic universal language. He drew parallels to the philosophical classification systems for creating such languages that were developed later by figures like Bishop Wilkins in his Essay Towards a Real Character and a Philosophical Language, published in 1668, and by George Delgarno around the same period. However, as Tiltman himself astutely noted, those later, more fully developed universal language systems tended to be highly systematic and logically structured, which might have made them more easily recognizable or at least amenable to a degree of structural analysis,
Right.
something that has largely eluded attempts on the Voynich manuscript.
So the Voynich manuscript feels less like a carefully constructed philosophical language and perhaps something more rudimentary or perhaps even idiosyncratic.
That was Tiltman's general impression.
Okay.
His analysis suggested a more complex and potentially less systematic approach, perhaps involving a mixture of different kinds of symbolic representation rather than a purely logical constructed system. In his own research into the historical development of universal language concepts, he came across a fascinating book titled The Universal Character, written by Cave Beck, published in 1657.
Okay.
Beck was an original Fellow of the Royal Society, and his system indeed presented a rather cumbersome and complex mixture of numerical codes and letter prefixes intended to represent a wide vocabulary.
What was the basic principle behind Cave Beck's universal character? How did it attempt to represent language?
As Plate 21 illustrates, Beck's system was essentially a dictionary code. He assigned unique numbers from 1 to 39999 to approximately 4,000 English words arranged alphabetically. Plate 22 provides an example of this numerical dictionary. He then devised a system of prefixes to indicate grammatical function. For instance, verbal infinitives were represented by the base number alone.
Okay.
Nouns were prefixed with the letter R, and adjectives with the letter Q synonyms were generally assigned the same numerical code as the primary word.
Okay.
Prepositions had their own set of equivalent codes, often starting with the letters S or T. Plurals were indicated by adding an S after the numerical code, and verb forms could have up to 3-letter prefixes to denote tense and other grammatical aspects, as shown in Plate 23.
Okay.
Each word or concept in his encoded text was separated by a comma.
It sounds incredibly intricate and not particularly user-friendly.
Not at all.
Did Tiltman see any potential parallels or connections between this system and the structure of the Voynich manuscript?
He did consider some possibilities. He wondered if the symbol he transcribed as G in the Voynich manuscript, or perhaps the combination 8G, might function similarly to Beck's comma as a word or concept delimiter.
Okay.
He also noted that the symbol 8 did appear in other contexts within the manuscript, just as the letter S had multiple grammatical functions in Beck's system. He also found it a curious coincidence that Beck's example for encoding the word days was 1480-148 rather than the expected 1484S according to his own rules for plurals. Interestingly, Beck's preface to his universal character mentions that this last century of years had seen considerable discussion and development of ideas for creating universal languages, pushing the timeline back to the mid-16th century, closer to some of the proposed dating for the Voynich manuscript.
And Tiltman also looked into even earlier mentions of universal character projects, linking them to Bishop Bedell and a man named Johnston.
Yes, in his research, Tiltman found references in biographies of Bishop William Bedell, who died in 1642,
Okay.
to a man named Johnston, who was apparently commissioned around 1641 to create a universal character. Bishop Bedell reportedly contributed a schematic framework for this project, and there's even some indication that parts of it were printed before the outbreak of a rebellion halted its further development. However, Tiltman points out a significant challenge to definitively linking the Voynich manuscript to these later universal language projects, the difficulty in firmly dating the manuscript itself.
Hmm.
While Cavebeck's work and these other endeavors fall into the 17th century, prominent scholars like Charles Singer suggested a late 16th century origin for the Voynich manuscript,
Yep.
and others, such as Professor Panofsky and the Cambridge University Library, have proposed.